A record number of people forced from their homes by conflict or persecution, from Syria to Central African Republic and South Sudan. What's driving the surge, though? What's being done to address the crisis? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. Well, they've become a barometer of violence, you could say, the number of people forcibly uprooted from their homes and their country. The UN's refugee agency says the global figure has, for the first time, exceeded 50 million. Well, that's equivalent to the entire population of Colombia or Spain or South Africa. And according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, the crisis is the result of what he's calling the immense costs of not ending wars and of failing to resolve or prevent conflict. And breaking down that figure of 51.2 million people recorded at the end of last year, almost 17 million were refugees, more than 33 million displaced within their own countries, while over 1 million are asylum seekers whose applications are pending. Much of the increase has been driven by the conflict in Syria. The UN says the number of Syrian refugees has reached 2.5 million, with 6.5 million people internally displaced. Now, that's 40% of Syria's entire population. And the UN says the latest conflict in Iraq has already forced more than 1 million people from their homes there. So, an inevitable consequence of modern conflict, or are there deeper reasons behind the increase? Let's bring in our guests and get their thoughts on this. In Geneva, we're joined by Adrian Edwards, spokesman for the UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR. Also joining us is Greg Varro from the World Food Programme's London office. And completing our panel in Warsaw is Michał Szydlacki, a humanitarian aid specialist who worked in Syria on the film Aleppo, Notes from the Dark. Welcome to the show. If I could start with Adrian, perhaps we should take a step back, and I want to ask the question, have we reached record numbers of displaced, or are we just getting better at, counting the displaced from war than we have been in the past?
Well, I do think we all get used to hearing ever-increasing numbers of displaced, but what we're seeing now with these very big numbers is a major step increase in global displacement. This is the cost of human conflict. You have more people displaced at the moment than we've seen outside of a World War period. So these are very big numbers of people and lots of problems, lots of help needed to deal with. But
Adrian, my question is, I mean, if these numbers are being compared to World War II, that's what, about 70 years ago? 70 years ago was still the colonial powers era, wasn't it? I mean, how many colonial powers counted the numbers of their victims, the victims of their adventures? Are we really seeing an increase in the number of displaced, or are we just getting better at counting how many people are affected by conflict?
Well, there is some truth in that we are getting better at counting these numbers, but there are also changes over time. Since the Second World War, you had an increase in conflicts within states as opposed to conflicts between states. And consequently, what you're seeing here is very, very large numbers of internally displaced people in particular. 33.3 million people internally displaced now is probably the highest it's ever been. It's certainly the highest numbers that we've seen in our more than 6 decades of existence.
All right, Greg, from the World Food Programme, what comes to your mind then is a cause and effect result perhaps of conflicts. Are conflicts really increasing? Is that the reason that's driving the increase?
Well, certainly, without doubt, if you look around the world and map where the largest numbers of refugees are, they are in the countries that are neighbouring those countries that are facing internal conflict. As Adrian has said, Syria, refugees have spilled over the borders into Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq and Egypt. Longer term, if you look back to the conflict in Afghanistan, there are huge numbers of refugees in Pakistan. Somalia is another country that's racked by conflict. Huge numbers of refugees in Kenya. More recently, the country that both the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the World Food Programme are really facing a struggle with is Central African Republic, where refugees are spilling across the border into countries that are ill-equipped to deal with their needs, countries that simply don't have the capacity or the resources to deal with the sheer scale of the numbers that they're now facing.
Mikhail, in Warsaw, why are conflicts increasing then? Are we becoming meaner as human beings to each other, or is this the result of the end of the bipolar world where we had two superpowers sort of putting a lid on everybody else's agendas?
I've spent the past 10 years working in countries of wars and other emergencies, and I do believe that the amount of conflicts across the world is growing because of our inability to really stop them. I mean, we got used to believing we do have an institution to prevent wars, the United Nations Security Council, which is simply not true. We do not have an effective institution in the world to prevent any conflict from happening. The only thing we have is basically political approaches, but this is based on greed.
So is that the reason, though? Are you saying the weakening of international institutions is leading to more conflict?
Of course, because we are not able to prevent politically oriented gains with the proper perception and support to basic human rights concepts and to human dignity. I mean, look at what Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, did when he advocated for the League of Nations. The League of Nations was supposed to never allow a war to happen again. And now we are in a situation where we see more conflicts happening because of our inability to stop them. Because we are basically looking at political gains, not at the human being itself.
Adrian, I wonder as well whether the age of communication is increasing the number of displaced. And let me explain what I mean by that. Maybe a century ago, news of, let's say, British forces bombing a village in Afghanistan might take a while to reach neighboring communities. Today, you know, with Twitter and Facebook and everything else, news that the ISIL is on the march towards Mosul can send people fleeing from the entire region before they've even arrived.
Well, certainly people are more aware because of better communication these days, and certainly much of the flight that we see of people is from fear of conflict. But I think
is that a positive? Is communication positive then?
Well, communications, of course, is a positive because people are better informed, and that's very important. But if you do step back on this, you'll see that the largest displaced populations last year, or the largest number of refugees, I should say, were coming from 3 countries: Afghanistan, Somalia, and Syria. So you had a combination there of countries which have been in conflict for a longer time and a new country in conflict. So what we have worldwide is a situation where conflicts are arising faster than they're being resolved. We are able to send home only about 400,000 refugees last year. A decade ago, we managed to achieve about 1 million. So finding solutions for people who are displaced is also becoming more difficult. So you've got this combination of a mixture of old and continuing conflicts and difficulties in finding solutions.
You mentioned some countries there. Now I want to look at 2 countries currently caught up in conflicts and the fallout that this can have. Afghanistan has more refugees than any other country in the world, while neighbour Pakistan hosts the most refugees. But a new offensive against the Taliban in northern Pakistan is driving people back across the borders. Jennifer Glass now explains from Afghanistan's capital, Kabul.
20 kilometers from the border with Pakistan in Afghanistan's host province, a new refugee camp is taking shape. The tents are just the beginning as Afghan officials prepare for an influx of people.
So far, we have registered 1,000 families. Thousands of people have fled, but they are scattered, living in houses. Some are in the mountains.
They want them all to come here, where there will be medical assistance, water, and other basic needs. Already, 1 exhausted refugee has died on the journey over the rugged border, and 1 vehicle overturned. Trucks are loaded to the brim with whatever the refugees can carry. Many fled before the military operation began in Pakistan, like Haji Feroz Khan.
The military came and put checkpoints around us. They didn't tell us to leave. Our elders went to them and were told not to worry. Stay where you are. But we were scared and we left.
He says they left their goats, cattle, and most of their belongings behind. Their village is practically empty. Finding a vehicle to get out was difficult.
The roads are closed. There are curfews. We couldn't even find any food. It's not our fight, and we are caught in the middle.
Some of the first refugees are in their own tents. They said they came here because the Afghans are their fellow tribesmen. The Pakistani Prime Minister has asked that Afghan forces help seal the border to prevent militants from coming across. The Pakistani military is expected to step up its ground operations next week. Jennifer Glass, Al Jazeera, Kabul.
Now, Greg, as the numbers of displaced increase, are you seeing the number or the amount of resources mobilized to deal with the problem also being increased or not?
Well, the resources that are required to deal with this problem around the world are absolutely staggering. If we go back to Syria alone, the operation run by the World Food Programme to feed people who are internally displaced and those in bordering countries is costing us some $42 million each week. Now, mobilizing those resources is easier when the international community is engaged and where there's some hope of a political solution. But when these problems become long-term problems that stick around for years, and the Syrian crisis, as you know too well, is has entered its third year, then it becomes more problematic. So it does become an issue, and that's where we begin to face problems.
Talking about problems, Mikhail, as I think you're aware, a group of international lawyers earlier this year argued in an open letter for aid agencies to take, shall we call it, a more determined approach to helping displaced people. Things like don't wait for permits. You've got the international legal backing you need. Do you think aid agencies should be changing their tactics?
Aid agencies should be going back to the tactic of our work 10 or 20 years ago, where we have expressed, I would say, larger solidarity with people by simply being with them. I mean, when we talk about the growing amount of displaced people in Syria, also the number is growing more rapidly because we haven't seen adequate, equal provision of aid, the official aid from the UN sources.
So how are they, hang on, Mikhail, how are aid agencies not being with people? What is it that you've seen in Syria that's led you to that conclusion?
Well, back in 2012, when I opened up an office in Aleppo city and another office in Idlib, we were, I would say, one of a few organizations really on the ground in opposition-controlled areas of northern Syria. And we have never faced any problem with the delivery of humanitarian aid, or we never faced a problem we wouldn't been able to solve. And when we look at the amount of need and the need of people of Syria to see agencies and UN agencies on the ground in also opposition-controlled areas on proper basis by being there every single day, then we can understand why people tend to feel completely abandoned, because we have taught them that we will not we will not help them by being with them.
All right,
it's
Greg is trying to get a word in, I think. Greg, your response to that, I could see you edging to get a word in there. Do you agree with that analysis? Perhaps aid agencies are simply not being with people as much as they could.
I mean, I think there is a perception that's perhaps wrong that the UN agencies and other agencies aren't on the ground doing anything. I mean, certainly the UN agencies have been ever present in Syria and were present long before this crisis erupted. And
well, Mikhail gives an example of what he's seen.
I have spent in northern Syria 6 months of my time in Aleppo city, in Idlib, also in Hama. And you do not have regular presence. The United Nations does not have regular presence on both sides of the conflict in terms of Syria.
Okay, Mikhail, hang on. Let's give Greg an opportunity to come back with that. He's given specific cities, Aleppo, Hama. Where's the regular presence?
Well, all I can say is that we are reaching inside Syria and have been reaching inside Syria between 3.5 and 4 million people a month. We have never said that we're able to access every single square kilometre of the country, but where we can't access, we certainly try to negotiate access, and when we can get through, our modus operandi is to exploit these small windows of opportunity and get aid in when we can.
Okay.
But there are very few organisations, and I'm not sure that Mikhail could name any, that have access to the entire landmass of Syria. I think he realises the true complexity and the true depth of insecurity that exists on the ground.
All right, let's bring Adrian into the discussion here.
But back in 2012, we didn't really have this level of insecurity, and people were greeting us inside with open arms.
All right,
and,
gentlemen.
well, let's go back to the issue of the letter. I mean, Aleppo is 40 kilometers from the Turkish border, and why only back in 2014 we've seen couple of convoys doing cross-border assistance to areas of northern Syria. I mean, I am a taxpayer. I wouldn't like to pay taxes to pay for 450-kilometer drive of aid from Damascus to Aleppo, where I can pay only for 40-kilometer drive. But this requires the UN to accept a letter from the international lawyers that said you do not require consent from the regime of Damascus to provide aid across the border from Turkey to,
Okay, Mikhail.
to Syria.
Okay, Mikhail, you've made your point. We're going to move on. Let me bring in Adrian into the discussion. You're now calling for non-traditional approaches. You're calling for non-traditional donors to step up. What exactly is it that you're calling for?
Well, if we just return to those comments there, I think it's very clear. Everyone would probably agree that much more needs to be done within these conflict zones, and that is the complexity of it. In the past, we were dealing with refugees displaced into neighbouring countries primarily. Today, the focus is increasingly on helping people in conflict zones. That brings with it many more difficulties. But when we go back to the needs here, we have at present global humanitarian operations are funded by a traditional group of donors mainly. With this huge increase we're now seeing in global displacement, we really need to look at traditional donors re-evaluating whether their existing aid budgets are efficient, are effective and sufficient for this, and B, whether non-traditional donors ought to be doing more to help. Funds is vital if humanitarian work is to move forward. And in addition, of course, to all of that, we have to have more done on the political solutions front.
But Adrian,
does humanitarians, we can help people as a palliative, but not as a solution to wars.
Right. Does the pattern of assistance need to change given the changing patterns of displacement? For example, now we're hearing that the average number of years that a displaced person will stay displaced is increasing. One figure I read, quoting the UNHCR, is that the average is 17 years. I mean, when you're looking at 17 years, that means things like kids being born into displacement. It means planning for very long-term life needs.
Well, absolutely. 17 years is correct. That is the average time that someone spends being a refugee, and that in itself is an outrage. People ought to be able to lead productive lives. They ought to be able to lead normal lives and have a means to move forward from where they are. That is a problem that needs solving. We need faster solutions for people in this dreadful situation. We are now in a world of much bigger displacement than we have seen in a long, long time. We have to have sufficient level of answers to deal with that. Part of that is funding. Part of that is how we deal new tactics for this situation. And of course, the third part is political solutions, which are absent in many cases.
All right, now we've been hearing about, of course, the pressure placed on neighbouring countries in times of conflict, but countries further afield can also find themselves the target of refugees and asylum seekers. Italy, for example, is seen as an easy access point into Europe, as Claudia Lavanga reports from Sicily.
Waiting in line for the freedom they risk their lives for. Reception centers like this one in the town of Pozzallo in southern Sicily are overwhelmed. They are struggling to cope with the hundreds of migrants arriving every day, mainly from Syria, Somalia and Eritrea.
No, I don't believe that something like this is going on here. So this is not the normal thing they're supposed to do for us. We need help.
I don't like this place because the kind of food they are giving us here, and we can't eat it. We can't eat the kind of food they are giving us here. So we need to leave this place and take us to better place. No movement, no walking around, you can't move out, only one place.
According to a new report, 58,000 people have been rescued off the coast of Italy so far this year. That's already more than double the amount for the entire of 2013 and close to the record number of arrivals in 2011 during the war in Libya. A dramatic increase of refugees fleeing war-torn Syria and a major boost in the rescue fleet deployed by the Italian Navy means that as many as 100,000 refugees and asylum seekers may reach Italy this year. There are simply too many migrants and not enough space for them all.
This reception center is located in the same port where these migrants disembarked. It was built to host about 180 people, but these days there are more than twice as many. While they are here, this is literally all they know about Italy.
According to charity Save the Children, most migrants' dream destination is not Italy, it is Sweden, Norway, Germany or Switzerland. But with the EU forcing migrants to apply for asylum in the country of entrance, Italy is the one bearing the brunt of the biggest migration from the Middle East and Africa into Europe in years. Claudio Lavanga, Al Jazeera, Pozzallo, Sicily.
So, Greg, listening to reports like that, you get the feeling that the number of host countries is also increasing. We're not talking just about countries in the immediate line of fire surrounding conflicts, but, you know, as far away as Italy or beyond.
Well, I'm not a specialist in this area. My specialism is food assistance, but I am familiar with meeting and talking refugees who've been fleeing conflicts. And I think one of the points that I'd like to make here is that you have to make a distinction about the different reasons why people move. Many of the refugees that I've spoken to who are fleeing conflict simply want to go home. They're not heading north to European destinations. They want the political solution and the circumstances that will allow them to return to their home villages, to the jobs that they've trained for, and to the people that they love. And it's as simple as that. And I think this is something that is really a point that gets lost when you hear these stories about some groups of refugees seeking asylum in European shores.
All right, Adrian, you know, you take one figure, for example, that the number of displaced is the equivalent to the entire population of Spain, and you think about that. The equivalent of the entire population of Spain potentially roaming the planet, displaced. What sort of strain does that put on the world? I mean, we're not just talking about the usual things we know about the healthcare systems, the education systems, or even, you know, culturally on the fabric of societies, tension, cultural tension, and so on.
It does indeed put pressure on the world. Countries receiving large numbers of refugees obviously have to deal with that. But let's not get our perspectives wrong on this. The numbers coming to Europe are significant, but overall 9 out of 10 refugees are staying in countries generally in the developing world. The main countries hosting refugees at the moment, Pakistan on the one hand, it's Iran, very large numbers in Lebanon too now. So 9 out of 10 of the world's refugees are not coming to Europe, to North America, to Australia, to the wealthier countries. They're staying very close to where conflict is happening. That's the reality of the situation at the moment. But yes, it's an immense pressure on those host countries. Look at Lebanon now. You have 1 Syrian refugee for every 4 of the population there. Right. And that represents a real challenge. So we have to help in those countries hosting these communities.
I'm going to bring Mikhail in for a quick 30 seconds. What about the many people in countries like Syria, as we know, who remain displaced within their own country? They must be feeling completely abandoned by everyone, their own country and the world.
Many of these people are displaced for a few or several times, and they have not really seen aid reaching them in an extent that really brings them back human dignity everyone deserves and gives them autonomy to choose what they feel is better for them. What we need is a thorough reform of the UN Security Council so that we have an institution to prevent wars. But we also need a thorough reform of the UN agencies.
We're going
because
to have to
I do
leave
believe
it there.
before 2003.
I'm afraid we are out of time. Let's thank our guests on this show. Adrian Edwards in Geneva, Greg Barrow in London, and Mikhail Shudlatsky in Warsaw. And please do add your voice to the discussion. Leave us your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or why not tweet us? Just go to @AJ Inside Story. I'm Sami Zaidan. Thanks for watching. It's goodbye for now.